So we are here to present a paper about Corpus 17, which is a philological corpus for 17th century French that have been designed by three researchers. Me, Simon Gabay, who's working at the University of Geneva, Alexandre Bartz, who's been an intern from the École des Chartes at the Université de Neuchâtel last year and who's now working at the University of Geneva. And finally, Yohann Deguin, who now works at the University of Rouen Normandy, but used to be working at the University of Rennes, which explains some changes between the paper and the presentation that I'm giving now. So the first problem is that when you think about 17th century French literature, and if you buy a book of Molière or Racine, you will quickly see that this literature is heavily modernized. And in the 17th century, there was something that was called graphic polyformism. The idea is simple, is that the same word can be written differently. And what scholars have done until now is that they have normalized, which means that they have aligned the spelling of the 17th century with the one that we have today, with the idea that it would make it more simple for readers to read. But it is now becoming a problem, because if it was easy to modernize a text, now that we have OCR engines that are pretty powerful, we can produce a lot of data that we cannot manually normalize. These create two problems: that for philological reasons, manual normalization will soon be discarded because we don't have the time. And then we need to find a solution about how can we do that, but we can also structure information in a way that we can keep former data that is not normalized, with the one that is normalized, and possibly with other additional information. So we are now facing different challenges. The first thing, and that is important to us, is to use open source and efficient tools that require minimal infrastructure. It is very important because not everyone has a big project, and then what you need is to be pretty efficient, but with limited money. Second thing is, what we need to do is to convert image scans into usable data and to keep the information as much as possible along the way. If you have a pipeline, a workflow, each time there is a new step, you keep the data that you had before. Then we need to link all the versions of the same information to enrich mining options. A data, a text, a token that is normalized need to be lemmatized. Then you can cross-search. You can use the spelling, but you can also use the part of speech, where you can also use the lemma, and you will always end up on the same token. And then another thing that is important is to make all the data available for researchers. Data that is used for training tools, but also the data that is produced at the end. In other words, what we can do, and what we need to do, is first to create an OCR model, then to provide linguistic normalization of the data, and then to provide also linguistic annotation, if possible with open source tools, and at the end have open data. Another thing that is important in this idea of all these tools is that it cannot be successive operations, but what we need is a functional workflow where the data that is coming out of the OCR is used for training the other tools. Because then, if you train the linguistic normalizer on data that doesn't look like the one coming out of the OCR, obviously it will not work. So the first thing that we've done is to create an OCR engine, an OCR model, using different OCR engines. And for that, we have created a massive data set of ground truth, about 30,000 lines in French of the 17th century, that we have unbalanced on purpose in two different ways. The first thing that we have done is that we have decided to use a lot of theater, because in theater we have realized that there are more capital letters, and these capital letters are usually underrepresented, and if they are underrepresented in the training set, then they will not be probably processed by the OCR model. The second thing that we have done is that we have used a lot of text from the first half of the century, and mainly poetry because it's in italic, and italic once again is underrepresented in the data usually. So when you have all these texts, the thing that you need to do is to transcribe them. how do you transcribe these data? We have decided to go for graphemic with some graphematic traits. First thing, no spelling normalization is introduced while transcribing. Second thing, abbreviation are not developed. And the third thing is that typos are not corrected and the long S is kept. We have even tried to create a second model that keeps aesthetic ligatures because we think that at the end it could improve mining options and that would have a certain interest. And we have realized that with limited training data, which is something like 1,500 lines, we have a correct character rate of 2.8%, which is a lot at the end, but still, we considering the amount of data that we have, we can be pretty optimistic about our capacity to provide this kind of data soon. With all these data, obviously, we needed to create a model, and then we have decided to go for two different solutions. The first one is Kraken. It is an OCR engine that is now developed at PSL in Paris. And the second thing is Calamari, which is developed in, I think, Würzburg in Germany. Why these two? Because they are complementary, that they are used by a lot of teams, but also because they come with a software or at least a solution, an application that helps users use the model that we have. So if we look at the results, we see that they're pretty good. Everything is above 95%. We can see here that we have also added out-of-domain data to see if the model can generalize. And there is an important thing here that we have to say is that if scores or accuracies are slightly lower for Kraken than Calamari, it has to be taken with a lot of caution because the error rate is not exactly calculated the same way. What we have to keep in mind is that results are pretty good and that we're pretty optimistic that soon it will become better and better. Now we move to another problem, which is linguistic normalization. So as we've said, raw transcription coming out of the OCR engine are improper for mining purposes. It creates a lot of problem because there is a lot of noise. First, readers of classical French text expects linguistically normalized version. So if we produce a corpus, we need to provide this kind of data because otherwise they won't read the text. Second, if we want to do mining, data mining, we need to reduce many variants to one single form. Present here the case of the verb être, to be, in the imparfait, être, which is now written in even another way. So how do we provide text that people want to read and data that has been normalized so that we can mine it? The process is the following. We need to modify and check the agglutination, the segmentation of words, correct certain letters like the long S that have disappeared, and we need to correct the spelling with the diacritics and add some accents. Follow an example here. And to do that, we have decided to go for neural translation. This task of normalization cannot be automated. If in some cases one word is always normalized the same way, which is the case for être, this is not exactly the case for other words. Take here the example of votre, which can be a possessive determiner or a pronoun. C'est le vôtre or c'est votre cheval. It is written the same way in the 17th century, but not today. So we need to disambiguate that. And to do that, translation softwares are probably the best because they are able to cope with this situation. I here give the example of to the that can be translated in au in French, which means that two words become one. So these softwares are very good at dealing with this situation. And we have tried two different solutions: statistical machine translation, SMT, and neural machine translation, NMT. And what we have realized is that with the same amount of data, we have better results with NMT. And we really hope that with more data, and we're creating it right now, we will have even better results. In all the scores that we give here, I think that the most relevant is probably word accuracy, which is the one on the very right. And 91% is pretty decent, and we really hope that soon it will become better. Finally, linguistic annotation. There is a paper that is presented in the same conference. I think that you should have a look at it so that you can give your opinion or know more about what we've done. But basically, the idea was to create a possibility to have lemmas and post tagging and morphology so that we can once again mine the text and find as much as possible information. But doing so, we wanted to keep interoperability and compatibility with other kind of data. So for the lemma, we have decided to use an authority list that is not only for 17th century, but also 16th and 18th century, but also a bit of medieval French. And when we look at the post, we have decided to use catex that is already used by the medievalists, and we thought that by doing so, we could more or less mix text and make queries on very, very long diachronic period, which means like Middle Ages, Renaissance, 17th century, and 18th century. And by doing these choices, we keep a lot of interoperability on the long run. Details of all the accuracies are in the other paper, but I here present the results, and we can see that it's pretty good for lemmas and for part of speech on normalized data and non-normalized data. We can see that models generalize pretty well. It's slightly better for the lemma than for the post, and it can be explained by the fact there is much more data to train the lemma model than for the part of speech model. Forgot to say that we have two different models, one for the lemma, one for the part of speech. To do that, we have used different corpora that are already available, that have been heavily corrected for the occasion, and mainly Corpus that has been prepared by Florent Cafiero and Jean-Baptiste Camps for an article, but for creating the data have helped a bit. And we have also used the Presto Corpus, especially its gold version for the part of speech, that once again has been heavily corrected, and we have added the morphology for each token. Now we move to another part, which is the data structure. So we have all this information. We have created the tools that help us normalize and annotate the text. And now what do we do with that? We have decided to follow the example of two other corpora, the DTA, the Deutsches Textarchiv, and another one, LTEC, that is very important to us because there are a lot of 19th century French novels, so keeping interoperability would be interesting. And what we have done is design a corpus organized in 3 layers. The first one is about establishing the text. So you have pages, you have lines, you can correct a bit typos, and you have to distinguish the text from the perithext, the running title, the number of the page, etc., etc., etc. The second is that we need to annotate the text. We need to distinguish prose from the verse. We need to get rid of all the information that is not literature properly and get rid of stage annotation, the name of the speaker, etc., etc., so that we can handle this kind of genre. Same thing with letters. If we want to have only the texts per se, we need to have a way to distinguish the letter from the opener and the closer. And then we need to handle things that come usually like the lists, some notes, a few headings, and basic named entities, because we thought that it could be interesting to know if there is a person or a place, can always be useful. Then a third level. The second level is produced manually, at least now. The third level is produced automatically, and it's where we inject all the data that we have from the tools that we have created, which is spelling normalization and also lemmatization, part of speech, morphology, etc., etc. And our idea is that these 3 steps follow the steps of the philologist. What we do is first we establish the text, then we do a basic annotation, and then we add all the things that we have afterwards. So we can stop at step 1, then move to step 2, and then when we have step 2, we can move to step 3, and there is some kind of a chronological order in the way we encode the text and in the 3 layers that we have designed. Metadata is very important. Once we have encoded all this information, we need to add metadata. The thing is that we have decided to do something that is not usually done for 17th century French, which is first to use printed text, which is normal, but also manuscripts. The problem is that both are described differently. A manuscript is unique, so it's described based on the conservation, in which library, which shelf marked, etc., etc., etc. And the book is printed, is identified, is described by the printing date, the printing place, the publisher, etc., etc., etc. So if we have two different kind of information, we need two different TEI headers if we speak about TEI. So what we have done actually is try to do ODD chaining. ODD chaining is a way to have a master ODD that contains sub-ODDs that we can use depending on the situation. If we have two TEI headers, we need to have two sub-ODDs, one for the printed text, one for the manuscript. And when we look at the text itself, we need to have one sub-ODD for the first, the second, and the third level. And then we can cope with all the situation with one single solution, and we thought that it was the best option that we could have. If you want to have a look at what is the data that we are producing right now at the very, very end, at the third level, it looks like that. You can see that there is a seg, which is the thing that we send to the normalizer, so it sends back the data that has been normalized, but also that we send to the limitizer and the posttagger, and then we inject all the data into TI encoding so that for each token, we have a maximum amount of information. We can see that, for instance, je, which is in the elided form, I apostrophe, is normalized j, and that the lemma is je, part of which is a proper pronoun personnel, proper pronoun, personal pronoun, and then the information about the morphology that is a singular. We have here added for the normalization a value, an attribute that tries to evaluate how accurate is the normalization that we're proposing. And this is very important because then we can sometimes have normalization for which we are not sure. If you want to see how we calculate, not calculate, but evaluate the quality of the normalization, you have to have a look at the paper, because we use a dictionary in JSON and we use also authority lists to try to normalize things on top of normalization that is done with neural machine translation. So now that we have a system, we need text. And we have decided to select a certain amount of text that are all very different. We can see here tragedies, comedies, tales, essays, novels, letters, a bit of manuscript, some poetry. We have also tried to pay attention to the date so that we do not have only text from the end of the century or the beginning of the century, etc., etc. And these are the texts that we are currently encoded. They have already been encoded, but we are following these 3 steps that we have described previously, and we hope to make that available probably in February. The website will be, I think, ready at this moment. Alexandre is working on it very hard, and I think it will be very good results at the very end. I want to end with an idea, which is this idea of the matter workflow. The idea that we have is that, okay, we have a system and then we have text. With the text, we process them with our workflow that produce data. Then the data can be corrected to retrain the tools. And then we can produce more data with new text that will be once again corrected, and all the tools will be retrained. And by doing so, creating a virtuous cycle that will help us improve the quality of the tools that we have, and therefore improve the quality of the data that we propose, because we have to think that the third level is produced entirely automatically, which means that at the end we can recreate the third level at will, and then we will improve the quality of the corpus while we are increasing its size, and we are at the same time increasing the quality of the tools and the accuracy that they have, all of them. So this was our project. Hope that you were interested, and if you have any question, please feel free to ask. Thank you.